All right, so have you ever, thought about what pushes someone to do something really awful? Like they cross the line from, just regular disagreements to like full-blown evil. We see these like super dramatic portrayals of evil villains all the time, in movies and TV shows. But what about in the real world? That's what we're going to be diving into today. Like the kind of unexpected and sometimes kind of uncomfortable realities of what makes people commit acts that we, consider evil. And we're going to be exploring this using this book called Making Evil, The Science Behind Humanity's Dark Side. It really gets you thinking, like, are people just born evil? It's funny, I was talking to a friend of mine the other day. We were talking about this news story about this guy who did something really shady. And my friend's like, oh, he was just born bad. But like, is it really that simple? Well, this book jumps right into this question using Hitler as an example.
Right.
Like, it's easy to just assume that someone like Hitler must have had a brain that was like wired for evil, right? But the book kind of throws a curveball and says there's actually no real proof that Hitler was mentally ill.
And actually thinking that way kind of lets people off the hook. It's more comfortable to just label someone as crazy than to consider the possibility that maybe, just maybe, anyone is capable of terrible things in certain situations. And that's where things get really interesting. The book talks about these concepts of de-individuation and dehumanization as being like major players in this whole evil equation. So de-individuation is basically when you feel anonymous, like you're lost in a crowd. Like when you're at a huge concert and everyone's going wild, it's like all of a sudden your inhibitions kind of disappear. You might do things you wouldn't normally do. I remember this one time, this is embarrassing. I was at a concert and I totally lost myself in the energy of the crowd, and like I ended up dancing on a table. Me, the person who usually avoids the dance floor like the plague. It was like, for a moment, it wasn't really me. So de-individuation can kind of explain how people who are otherwise totally normal can get caught up in things like mob mentality or even like online trolling. It's like the anonymity gives them the shield and their sense of personal responsibility just fades away.
Then you've got dehumanization, which is even more disturbing. This is about seeing other people as less than human, like stripping away their individuality and making it easier to justify hurting them. Think about war propaganda and how it often portrays the enemy as these like faceless monsters, or racist language that reduces people to just stereotypes. It's all about making it psychologically easier to inflict pain and suffering on others.
Okay, but here's the real kicker, and this one like totally blew my mind. The book talks about this experiment where researchers had people use this fake killing machine to crush bugs. And get this, they even gave the bugs cute names like Muffin Ike and Tootsie. Like, can you believe that? Naming bugs before you have people kill them. It sounds so crazy, right? But here's the really unsettling part. The experiment found that a lot of people, particularly those who showed signs of what they call subclinical sadism, actually enjoyed hurting the bugs. And before you start looking at everyone around you with suspicion, remember, this doesn't mean we're all secretly sadists. It's more nuanced than that. But it does make you think, right? Like, do you think you would have hesitated to crush those bugs? Would you have felt any empathy for little Muffin or Ike or Tootsie? Thankfully, no bugs were actually harmed in this experiment. Right. But it does raise this big question. If we all have this potential for cruelty, what about situations where killing seems justified? Like in self-defense or in war. It's like that whole trolley problem thing. Have you heard of that? It's this classic thought experiment in ethics where you have to make this impossible choice. So imagine there's this runaway trolley barreling down the tracks, and there are 5 people tied to the tracks ahead. You have the option to pull a lever and divert the trolley onto a side track, but there's one person tied to that track, so you get to sacrifice one person to save 5. It's such a tough question, right? And it gets even more complicated when you start adding variations to the scenario that introduce things like gender into the mix. For instance, one version of the trolley problem asks you to choose between sacrificing a man or a woman. And researchers have found that people, particularly men, are much more likely to choose to save the woman.
Which makes you think about all those like deeply ingrained social expectations we all carry around, right? Like no one wants to be that guy who chose to kill the woman. It highlights how our moral decisions aren't always like black and white. It's not just cold logic. Emotions and biases play a role too. But hold on, because it's about to get even more complicated. Let's talk about technology and how it might be affecting our capacity for, well, evil. I mean, think about it. We're all glued to our phones and computers these days. And while technology obviously has its perks, it also has this weird power to like amplify the worst parts of human behavior. A perfect example of this is the case of Tay, this AI chatbot developed by Microsoft. It was designed to learn from online conversations, but things took a dark turn pretty quickly. Tay started spewing out all this hate speech because of the toxic stuff it was exposed to online.
It's a pretty stark reminder of how technology can take things to a whole other level, for better or for worse. And there's this other case that really messes with my head. It's about the cannibal cop. I mean, the name itself is terrifying, right?
Yeah.
His police officer was caught posting these super graphic cannibalistic fantasies online, which eventually led to his arrest. And this case raises so many questions. Like, when does a thought cross the line into a potential crime? Where do we even draw that line? And it gets even more complex when you consider that the book points out how surprisingly common violent sexual fantasies, even those involving rape, can be. Now, it's important to emphasize that having these fantasies doesn't necessarily mean someone is going to act on them in harmful ways. It all comes down to consent. Having a fantasy doesn't make you a bad person. It's all about how you act on your desires and respecting the boundaries of other people. But the book also tackles this really sensitive topic of rape fantasies. It's a tough subject, and it's super important to approach it with nuance and understanding. The book highlights this study that found a significant percentage of both men and women reported being aroused by the idea of having sex with a non-consenting stranger. It's a really heavy topic, no doubt. But it's crucial to remember that sexual fantasies are complex and often don't actually reflect our real-life morals or desires. So why do people have these fantasies? Well, researchers are still trying to figure that out. But it seems like they might tap into desires for power and control and maybe even transgression. Like, in the safe space of our imagination, we can explore boundaries and experiment with different roles that we would never actually act out in real life. Our brains can be pretty wild, right? Like, when we're not bound by the rules of reality, our thoughts can wander into some pretty dark and unexpected places. And I think it's really important to be able to talk about these things openly and honestly without shame or judgment. The more we understand about human sexuality, the better equipped we'll be to navigate the complexities of relationships and consent. Speaking of navigating complexities, remember the cannibal cop case we talked about earlier? Well, guess what? He was eventually exonerated on appeal because there wasn't actually any evidence that he planned to act on his fantasies. So he's a free man now. But this whole case raises some really important questions about the legal and ethical implications of online fantasies. Like, where do we draw the line? When does a thought or a fantasy become a potential crime? It's a tough question, and I don't claim to have all the answers. But I think it's crucial to consider the context and the intent behind someone's actions before jumping to conclusions. So we've covered a lot of ground here, exploring some pretty dark and disturbing aspects of human nature. But what's the takeaway? What does it all mean? Well, the book Making Evil doesn't give us any easy answers. It's not a simple guide to good and evil. Instead, it challenges us to confront the incredible complexity of human behavior. We can't just categorize people as good or evil. It's way more nuanced than that. We all have the capacity for both, and understanding that is the first step towards addressing the problem of evil in the world. It's not about labeling people. It's about trying to understand the complex interplay of factors that shape our choices and our actions. So what can we do with this knowledge? Where do we go from here? Well, the book suggests that it all starts with awareness. We need to be aware of our own biases, our own potential for cruelty, and the ways in which we might be unknowingly contributing to harmful systems. And once we have that awareness, we can start to make different choices. We can choose to be more empathetic, more compassionate, and more courageous in speaking up against injustice. It's like, even though the world could be a pretty messed up place, we each have the power to make it just a little bit better. And that starts with each one of us. So to wrap up our deep dive into Making Evil, I think the book does a fantastic job of prompting us to think critically about human nature, both the good and the bad. It pushes us to confront our own capacity for evil, to understand the forces that shape our choices, and ultimately to choose to be a force for good in the world. If you're interested in exploring these topics further, I highly recommend checking out the book for yourself. Until next time, keep diving deep and keep questioning everything. So we've been talking about individual actions and thoughts, but what about the role of groups and systems in all of this? How do ordinary people become complicit in these really horrific acts? The book dives into that too, and it's pretty chilling, to be honest. It makes me think about historical examples like the rise of Hitler and the Holocaust. A lot of Germans, even those who weren't initially anti-Semitic, ended up supporting the Nazi regime. And the book talks about this pastor, Martin Niemöller, who later realized the horror of what was happening. And he even ended up in a concentration camp himself. And after the war, he wrote this incredibly powerful poem about the dangers of staying silent when you see evil happening. That chilling line, first they came for the socialists, and I did not speak out because I was not a socialist. Then they came for others, group by group, until finally they came for him, and there was no one left to speak up. It's a powerful message about the responsibility we all have to stand up against injustice, even when it doesn't directly affect us. But it's not always easy to speak out, is it? Like, why do we sometimes stay silent even when we know something is wrong? It's easy to just say it's fear or apathy, but it's often way more complicated than that. This book points to the power of social pressure. Like, we have this deep-seated need to conform to the norms of our group, even when those norms clash with our own personal values. It's like this invisible force that can make us do things we wouldn't normally do. There's this famous experiment, the Milgram experiment, that illustrates this point perfectly. In this experiment, participants were told to deliver electric shocks to another person, and the shocks increased in intensity with each wrong answer. And the crazy thing is, even though the participants could hear the person screaming in pain, most of them continued to obey the experimenter's orders. It's kind of mind-blowing, right? Like, how can people be so easily swayed by authority figures? Like, we want to believe that they know what they're doing, so we just go along with it even if it feels wrong. And it's not just about blind obedience. There's also this thing called the diffusion of responsibility, especially when we're in a group setting. It's like we assume someone else will step up and do the right thing so we don't have to. I remember reading about the Kitty Genovese case, where this woman was murdered in New York City while like tons of people supposedly witnessed the attack but didn't do anything to help. It's one of those cases that just sticks with you, you know? It's horrifying to think that so many people could just stand by and watch something like that happen. Of course, later research suggests that some of the details of the Genovese case might have been exaggerated, but it still illustrates this powerful bystander effect. The more witnesses there are, the less likely any individual is to take action. It's like everyone assumes someone else will do something, and as a result, no one does anything. But, okay, so does this mean we're all doomed to be passive bystanders when bad things happen? Like, is there any hope for us? Thankfully, it's not all doom and gloom. The book highlights some research showing that bystander intervention is actually more likely when people feel a sense of personal responsibility and when they perceive the situation as dangerous. It's like when you feel like you're the only one who can help, you're more likely to step up. And this is where things start to get a bit more hopeful. The book suggests that we can actually cultivate a culture of speaking up, of intervening when we see something wrong. It all starts with recognizing our own biases and understanding how we might be contributing to harmful systems, even unintentionally. It's like we can't just assume we're the good guys and everyone else is the problem. We all have a responsibility to challenge injustice, even when it's uncomfortable or inconvenient. And this applies to so many situations, from calling out everyday sexism and racism to speaking up against unethical behavior in our workplaces. It's about creating a culture where people feel empowered to speak up and do the right thing. And speaking of workplaces, the book talks about this concept of instrumental evil. It's basically when people do bad things for personal gain, often financial gain. It's like they convince themselves that the ends justify the means, even if the means involve exploiting or harming other people. We see this all the time, right? Companies putting profits over people, prioritizing the bottom line over ethical considerations. It's a classic case of dehumanization. When you see people as just commodities or cogs in a machine, it becomes easier to exploit them. The book cites this chilling statistic from a slavery economist who estimates that slavery generates up to $150 billion in profits globally each year. $150 billion. It's just, it's mind-boggling the scale of exploitation happening right now. And you have to wonder, how do people who engage in that kind of exploitation live with themselves? Like, the cognitive dissonance must be intense. You're like, how do you justify those horrific actions to yourself? Well, the book suggests that people often rationalize their behavior by clinging to this belief that they're somehow superior to the people they're exploiting. They might tell themselves that the people they're enslaving are somehow less than human, deserving of their fate. It's a disturbing thought, but it ties back to the just world hypothesis. This idea that people get what they deserve, that good things happen to good people and bad things happen to bad people. It's a way for us to maintain our sense of security and control in the world. But it can also lead to some really harmful consequences, like victim blaming and apathy towards those who are suffering. It's easier to believe that people are poor or enslaved because they somehow deserve it than to acknowledge the systemic injustices that perpetuate inequality. And this kind of thinking can be incredibly dangerous. It allows us to distance ourselves from the suffering of others and avoid taking responsibility for creating a more just and equitable world. So what can we do about it? How do we break out of this cycle of apathy and complicity? Well, the book emphasizes the importance of empathy. It's about recognizing the shared humanity of all people, regardless of their circumstances. We need to challenge our own biases, speak against injustice, and support organizations that are working to create a more equitable world. It starts with small acts of kindness and compassion. And it's important to remember that we're not alone in this fight. There are countless people around the world working tirelessly to make a positive impact, It's like, even though there's a lot of darkness out there, there's also a lot of light. It's up to each of us to choose which side we want to be on. Okay, so we've explored the psychology of evil, the dangers of compliance, and the importance of empathy. What else can we glean from this book? Well, it also delves into some fascinating and sometimes uncomfortable realities about human sexuality, and this is where things get, well, a little spicy. Have you ever, felt sexually aroused by something that you thought other people might find unusual? I'll admit it, I have. I mean, who hasn't, right? We all have our little quirks and kinks. But the point is, what's considered normal sexually can be pretty narrow, and there's actually a lot of variation in human desires. The book talks about paraphilic interests, which basically means being aroused by something that's not typically considered mainstream. So, what are we talking about here? Well, the book cites a study that asked over 1,000 people about their sexual fantasies. And some of the most common ones might surprise you. For example, voyeurism. The idea of watching someone naked or having sex without them knowing was actually the most arousing fantasy for both men and women in this study. It's kind of understandable, right? That whole forbidden fruit thing. Still pretty unexpected to be the top fantasy for so many people. Fetishism was also pretty common, like being aroused by inanimate objects, things like shoes or leather shoes. I guess I can see that. I mean, a nice pair of shoes can definitely be appealing. But there were also fantasies about exhibitionism, like the thrill of exposing yourself to other people, and frauderism, which is rubbing against someone without their consent. Okay, now things are getting a little creepy. And of course, there's the more extreme end of the spectrum, like sadomasochism, which involves inflicting or receiving pain during sex. Definitely not my cup of tea, but hey, different strokes for different folks, right? The important thing the book emphasizes is that even these less mainstream fantasies are often just that, fantasies. They don't necessarily mean someone is going to act on them in harmful ways. It all comes down to consent. Having a fantasy doesn't make you a bad person. It's all about how you act on your desires and respecting the boundaries of other people. But the book also tackles this really sensitive topic, rape fantasies. It's a tough subject, and it's important to approach it with nuance and understanding. The book highlights a study that found that a significant percentage of both men and women reported being aroused by the idea of having sex with a non-consenting stranger. It's a heavy topic, no doubt. But it's crucial to remember that sexual fantasies are complex and often don't reflect our real-life morals or desires. So why do people have these fantasies in the first place? Well, that's something researchers are still trying to figure out. But it seems like they might tap into desires for power control and transgression. It's like in the safe space of our imagination, we can explore boundaries and experiment with different roles that we would never act out in real life. Our brains can be pretty wild, right? Like when we're not bound by the rules of reality, our thoughts can wander into some pretty dark and unexpected places. And I think it's crucial to be able to talk about these things openly and honestly without shame or judgment. The more we understand about human sexuality, the better equipped we are to navigate the complexities of relationships and consent. Speaking of navigating complexities, remember the cannibal cop case we talked about earlier? Well, guess what? He was eventually exonerated on appeal because there wasn't any evidence that he planned to actually act on his fantasies. So he's a free man. But this whole case raises some really important questions about the legal and ethical implications of online fantasies. Like, where do we draw the line? When does a thought or a fantasy become a potential crime? It's a tough question, and I don't claim to have all the answers. But I think it's crucial to consider the context and intent behind someone's actions before jumping to conclusions. Okay, so we talked about a lot of dark and kind of disturbing stuff today, right? But what's the takeaway? What does it all mean? The book, it doesn't shy away from the uncomfortable stuff about, human nature, and it definitely left me with a lot to think about. You know that saying, when you stare into the abyss stares back? Yeah, this book kind of felt like that. But in a good way, I think. It makes you look at those, shadowy parts of ourselves that we usually try to ignore. One of the things that really stuck with me is how the book challenges that whole simple idea of good versus evil.
Yeah.
We see it all the time in movies and stories, right? But it's not really that black and white. You know what I mean? Instead, it's saying it's way more complicated. The book highlights how incredibly complex human behavior is. And it argues that we all have the capacity for both good and evil. I mean, think about it. We've all done things we're not proud of, right? Maybe we've lied or cheated or said something hurtful, even if we didn't mean to. It's part of being human, And on the flip side, even people who do really terrible things, they might still have some capacity for kindness or empathy in other parts of their lives. It's not about excusing bad behavior. It's about trying to understand all those factors that go into it, So the book dives into how things like our childhood, how we were raised, our social environment, even our biology, can influence our choices and actions. And also explores how big picture stuff like systemic factors, things like poverty and discrimination and lack of opportunity, how all that can create this breeding ground for what we see as evil. And here's where things get really interesting, I think. The book suggests that maybe instead of just focusing on punishing evil, we should be putting more energy into like preventing it. It's kind of like tackling the disease, Like we don't just try to treat the symptoms, we try to understand what's causing it and how to stop it from spreading. And that's what the book is saying about evil. Like we need to shift from retribution to rehabilitation, from punishment to understand. And that doesn't mean letting people off the hook for doing bad things, but it's about recognizing that everyone has the potential to change, to grow. It's about building a more just world, a more fair world, where everybody has the opportunity to live up to their full potential. So what can we actually do? Like, what are some concrete steps? Well, the book offers a few. First, we need to work on being more empathetic, more compassionate. It's easy to like demonize people when they do bad things, but it's important to remember that they're still human beings with their own stories and their own struggles. Second, we got to challenge our own biases. We all have them, whether we know it or not. And these biases, they can really affect how we see things and what we do, often without us even realizing it. And then third, we need to speak up when we see injustice whenever we see it. I know it's not always easy, but if we stay silent, it kind of sends the message that we're okay with what's happening. And finally, it's important to support those groups and organizations that are out there trying to make the world a better place, a more just and fair place. I know it sounds like a lot, but even small things can make a difference. It's like that saying, right? Be the change you want to see in the world. It might sound cheesy, but it's true. Like, if we each do our part, it can create this ripple effect, and those ripples, they can lead to some really big changes. So yeah, this book, it was a real eye-opener for me. It definitely made me rethink some things, like my own ideas about evil. And yeah, it made me face some uncomfortable truths about what it means to be human. But honestly, it also left me feeling kind of hopeful. Because at the end of the day, it's about realizing that we have the power to choose, to be better, to do better. Like we have the power to make a difference, a real difference. So if you're looking for a book that will really make you think, challenge your assumptions, maybe leave you with more questions than answers, I definitely recommend checking out Making Evil, The Science Behind Humanity's Dark Side. It's a deep dive into the dark stuff for sure. But it also shows us that, there's a path towards a better future. It's up to us to choose it. All right, that's it for today's deep dive. Until next time, keep thinking, keep questioning, and keep searching for those little ways to make the world a better place.